being here today. Today I have one of my friends who I met recently on Clubhouse, and he works with Alex Fair, one of the other individuals I've interviewed through this video series. So Avisha, I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Awesome. So just before we begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. Avisha Ness-Iver is the Chief Technology Officer of Vera Biotech, partner at Labzero, venture partner at MedStarter Venture Fund, and Chief Science Officer at MedStarter Direct. Avisha is an electrical engineer, COVID scientist, air quality specialist, serial entrepreneur, personal health consultant, and ruthless self-optimizer. A summa cum laude graduate of the University of Maryland with a master's in signal processing and machine learning, Avisha spent years developing and carrying out quality control programs for MRI machines. After discovering a passion for health and nutrition, he decided to direct his engineering training towards learning about the human body and applying a scientific mindset towards its optimization. This launched a personal quest of biohacking, self-improvement, event organizing, writing, speaking, and co-founding his own health tech startup. With a weekly reading average of 2 books and 30 scientific research journal articles, Avisha is constantly on the lookout for ways to apply cutting-edge science to both his business endeavors and personal performance. Since the pandemic began, Avisha has made it his mission to read every published research paper on COVID transmission and to apply that knowledge towards developing science-backed reopening strategies for buildings and businesses that can help prevent the spread of the disease. Wow, that's pretty impressive, Avisha. I really don't know what to say. How many papers have you read about COVID?
I would say at this point, close to 1,500.
Wow. I mean, that's impressive. And are you reading all of these, or are you like listening to them, or?
I use a combination, so it depends. I scan through as many of the most recently published papers as possible. The ones that strike my attention, I'll go through and actually read through all rather than just the abstracts or conclusions. I basically have a system for, depending on how interesting I think the paper actually is, that will determine the level of rigor that I give it, and have like a hierarchy. Start off reading the abstract, then go and look at the diagrams, then ideally look at the conclusions and methods. And if I find it really fascinating, I'll do a deep dive. Okay. Generally, when I read online articles, I alternate between actually reading online, or I have varying different text-to-speech programs that'll go and shift it into audio format so I can listen to it while doing other things, just to try and optimize my time and speed it up a lot. But it really depends on how much the visuals are really necessary for the topic and how much of my attention I want to devote to it.
Wow, that's really impressive. I had another, so, you know, I know a little bit about the work that you're doing with MedStarter, but why don't you tell the audience a little bit more about your work with MedStarter, and then, you know, a little bit more about the work you're doing with Active Pure, because I feel like those two topics are super relevant to what's going on today in the world. And just so you guys know, today is January 28th, 2021.
Sure. So I first met Alex Fair, the founder of MedStarter, probably 3 years ago. I went to an event that he was hosting in New York, and I thought the event was really cool. So I went over to him afterwards and I said, "Hey, I like what you're doing. How can I help?" That sort of started me on the path of helping him run various different healthcare related events, pitch competitions, went with him to varying different conferences, helped out in various different ways. I was originally there actually because of a biotech company that I had started called Vera Biotech, where we developed a method to refill expired EpiPens. That's actually something that's still in progress. Right now, we were a little bit stalled up due to COVID. The FDA decided that if it's not COVID related, they don't care. So that progression sort of is currently on pause, although we're about to start a crowdfunding campaign. But
oh, nice.
I then, after Alex and John, his brother, they started MedStarter Ventures, which is the venture capital arm of MedStarter, where they basically look at all these different companies that they find through pitch competitions, figure out which ones are really the top of the totem pole and invest in them, because as long as they're going through all the effort of funding these competitions, they want to participate in the companies that are the most promising. So I came on and really act as a technical vetter. I go and look at the technologies, look at the companies, and figure out which ones are legitimate, which ones have solid science that's actually marketable and they can go and take it to market. When the pandemic hit, MedStarter found themselves sitting in between all these new companies with amazing innovations and a lot of important stakeholders in the medical space. And they realized that there is a beautiful opportunity here to really help out and say, these are the technologies that we know can make a difference with the pandemic. And the most promising of the bunch was actually not a startup, but instead another company that we were related to in various ways that had been manufacturing really high-end air purification technology. This is called Active Pure Tech.
Mm-hmm.
Up until the pandemic, air quality was sort of a background concern for most people. Nobody cares about super high-end air purification unless they had really bad asthma or allergies, something where they had to take it to the next level, or if it was an operating room that needed a clean room environment, something like that. So using a really high-end air purification tech really was not in most people's radar. Then suddenly COVID hit and we realized the way that this stuff works actually is perfect at breaking down airborne viruses in the air itself. And that's something that is obviously extremely relevant at the moment, especially as it really came out that COVID is transmitted via aerosols. So this is one of the few technologies that can actually go and impact that transmission.
So how does it break down the particles of virus and the bacteria particles? I read a little bit about it, but I was just trying to understand it more.
Understandable. It's not a super simple process to understand up front. And we end up spending a lot of time really trying to educate people on how it works to really understand and feel safe. So the way that it operates is through a process called photocatalytic oxidation. Big word, but basically what it means is it uses a UV light not to directly kill any sort of virus. There's a lot of UV-based systems that are being used right now for sterilization, for air purification. But while it does work for sterilization, the problem with air purification when it comes to UV is that for it to directly kill a pathogen, it's based on the intensity of the bulb and the exposure time. And when you are talking about air flowing through a duct, because you can't have UV operating in an occupied space, they have to put it in the ducts. And when that air is moving through the ducts, it's moving at hundreds of feet per second. It doesn't have time to really sit and get killed. That's why the EPA, ASHRAE, they all say that when you're using UV, it should be an adjunct solution, not a sole solution, because it's never going to get a full kill. Which brings me back to photocatalytic oxidation. It's a way of harnessing that UV light and not using it to directly kill anything, but instead the UV light shines on a photocatalytic material, a matrix that's coated in a titanium dioxide doped with other components. Basically, the UV light shines on this cool looking honeycomb matrix and it causes basically it knocks electrons up into an energized state. And when moisture passes through this matrix, with the water and oxygen that's in the air react at the surface of said matrix and turn into oxidative particles. So you've got this cell, it has a UV bulb and a photocatalytic matrix. The air flows through it and reacts and turns into oxidative particles. These are hydroxyl radicals, superoxides, hydrogen peroxide that then get blown out into the room. And the first question I always get is, oh, you just said hydrogen peroxide. Isn't that dangerous? The answer is yes, but so is anything in enough quantity. It's always a matter of the dose makes the poison. The atmosphere itself actually has multiple self-cleaning mechanisms that help to break down contaminants outside. It's one of the reasons why outdoors is so much safer in general, because the light reacts with moisture and particles in the air to produce hydrogen peroxide and superoxides and hydroxyl radicals in small concentrations. So what we're doing is basically taking this natural process that the sun triggers in the outdoor atmosphere that you don't get inside, and we are taking it and bringing it indoors, producing similar levels of concentrations of these particles. They go out and fill the space. And then when I'm in the room, rather than breathing out infectious particles, I cough, I sneeze, I breathe. And with your standard sort of HEPA air filter, you would have to wait until those particles spread throughout the room, infect other people, and then eventually get passed through the filter. What this does is it fills the room with these oxidative particles that as soon as you exhale, it immediately starts breaking them down. These oxidative particles react with the surface of the pathogen. Coronaviruses are coated in a outer lipid layer. And just like you can use soap and it is just as effective at disinfecting as a alcohol-based hand sanitizer because soap breaks down lipids, fats. Similarly, these
Mhm.
oxidative particles will go and poke a hole in that outer lipid membrane and inactivate the virus. Give it enough time, it'll turn it into just CO2 and H2O, fully getting rid of it. But step one, and what happens really, really quickly, is it inactivates it. It makes it totally inert, not harmful. So did that?
Now, how were you able to study that? Sorry, Visha, I had a question because, I saw the data that you guys had published or you guys have written about reduction of transmission of COVID. How are you able to study that in a live setting when you really can't compare it, or you don't have a placebo that you can compare it to?
So there are a handful of different ways. When it comes to a placebo, we're actually running a trial in the Cleveland Clinic right now, where it's a double-blind randomized controlled trial, where across 50 operating rooms, we've got the medical ARIS unit that's FDA cleared, class 2 medical device. Those are active in half of the operating rooms, and then dummy versions of them are active in the other half. And they're actually measuring nosocomial infections, hospital induced infections, and seeing how it impacts the infection rate. So that's a very
Nice.
objective, like extremely scientific method of measuring it. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
that's a 2-year trial, so we're not going to get the results for a while.
Right.
So
Right.
the
Right.
way that we can measure and know that it works is through multiple different stages. Number one, we're able to go and in a controlled laboratory setting, actually measure the reduction where we introduce varying different types of pathogens, mold, bacteria, fungi, viruses, including SARS-CoV-2, which has been tested. And we can measure the actual elimination rate by doing air sampling, culturing, and figure out how quickly is it actually eliminating stuff in a controlled laboratory setting. When
Hmm.
you're talking about a real life setting, that's harder because you're never going to want to introduce a virus into a real life setting and then measure it. And measuring airborne viruses is actually very difficult in that type of setting.
Yeah.
So what we do is several fold. Number one is for a lot of our case studies, we'll go into, say, a school or an assisted living facility, take a bunch of measurements of the ambient bacteria, mold, fungi, air pollution in the space.
Hmm.
We'll send that off to a third-party lab, have it cultured, measured, get the full breakdown. Then we'll install a bunch of units, wait a couple of weeks, and we'll come back and do another set of measurements. And we see,
Hmm.
on average, like an 80% reduction in all these different types of pathogens. And because a coronavirus is actually a lot easier to kill than pretty much any other type of bacteria or mold, we can then assume that in the unfortunate event where an infectious person comes in and SARS-CoV-2 is released into the air, then it's going to have an equal to or greater effect at breaking that down. And we've actually seen through some previous installations, like before the pandemic hit, we had a couple different school installations where after installing Active Pure Tech, there was an 80% reduction in flu-related dismissals from year to year, showing a very real reduction in the transmission of an airborne respiratory virus.
Interesting. Um, I mean, that's actually very relevant. Like, obviously, I'm as an anesthesiologist, we're in the operating room like 24/7. And I remember in the peak of the pandemic, a lot of us were afraid of transmission within the hospital. There were that we had heard that they had cultured or they had taken samples from the vents in the rooms, and there was found to have virus particles in them. Whether those were alive or inactive, we didn't know, but still, it gave us a sense of anxiety. So a lot of people started wearing like N95s in the call rooms, even when they were sleeping, because they were just so afraid that the particles were in the air.
Yeah.
Um,
That makes sense, especially in that stage when we really didn't understand very well. At this point, we've pretty much realized that there's almost no fomite transmission of the disease. It's not really transmitted via surfaces. It is mostly airborne. But when it comes
okay.
to viruses hanging out like on the filters or on the vents themselves, most of that, the studies finding it are basically just looking at the viral RNA, not infectious virus particles. So there's
Right.
not really much of a worry of the live virus being transmitted in that way. But whatever is coming up in the air, that can hang around for hours, and that has been shown to be live and infectious. So that's really the biggest problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so like fast forward 15 years, you're doing a lot of work now in air quality and hospitals. And you have a lot of experience in the biotech world. So how do you see medicine being practiced differently in 15 years?
In many different ways, there will be a lot of changes. Right now,
Yeah.
we're at the cusp of change in multiple different arenas. And the largest of those, I'd say, are twofold. One is the applications of AI to the medical field in several different ways that I'll get into in a second. The other is really miniaturized robotics, as well as actually the third pillar is diagnostic testing.
Hmm.
So the way that the medical field progressed in general was doctors learned over the course of centuries how to diagnose varying different illnesses based on the human way, which is the human body is very good at picking up on a large data stream and based on experience, picking out, oh, I've seen lots of patients like this before. You probably have something like this, and this will probably treat it very well. And that's something that we do instinctively, which is why a very experienced doctor will often give a much more accurate diagnosis than someone just coming out of medical school, even though they've read all the same sort of texts, you would hope. However, most of our diagnostic testing was designed in that sort of way to be read by a human. So we've
Yeah.
looked for the variables that are the most deterministic for the broadest range of diseases. You go and you get a basic blood panel. They're looking at your white blood cell count. They're looking at your overall like biomarkers like your blood pressure and your heart rate and temperature. These are things that, yeah, if your blood pressure is really high, if your cholesterol is super high, that's going to give you a lot of like a big indication that something is wrong. But honestly, it's not so great at telling you exactly what is wrong. And that is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that can be measured about the human body. I've gone and gotten extensive blood panels done on myself where there are literally hundreds of different biomarkers being measured, most of which, if you took it to an average physician, they would have no clue what to do with it. Because honestly, what human can go and look at hundreds of different metrics and see how they all work together to really describe what's going on in the body? Yeah, there are some people who are getting there with a pretty good level of diagnostic ability, but this is where the shift is going to happen and machines are going to come in. What AI is amazing at is taking advantage of massive, massive amounts of data and relating that to diagnoses and figuring out what can we learn, what is actually the most indicative, what should we pay attention to. Then they will give that to the doctor and say, this is the AI interpretation. Now you, with your human knowledge and reasoning, make use of that as a tool to come up with a much more accurate diagnosis. So it's going to end up with a symbiosis between human and machine, where a lot of the detailed diagnostics are going to happen on the machine level, and then the interpretation and human interaction will be more from the physician.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. Like, I don't think that physicians will be replaced, but I do think that AI will be used as a tool to assist physicians. And it's already being used as a tool in so many ways. And I think it'll just help enhance the way physicians practice. It may provide them with more information and also allow them, it'll give them a little bit of guidance in many ways, a little more information. And I've seen a lot of, new biomarkers and a lot of new laboratory values that have come to the surface that, like you said, I have no knowledge about. Um, but I do see that patients are getting a hold of this information and they're coming to the physician and they're saying, what do I do with this information? So it's going to be really interesting.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the other side, which is I believe that maybe not in quite 15 years, but say 50 years from now, we're going to look
Yeah.
back on how we've performed surgery and think that it was barbaric. People going in with saws and drills and cutting through all these different layers of muscle and fascia and skin. We're going to get to the point where if we want to perform surgery, we inject tiny little robots into the body that go and make small little changes. And that will be able to take care of the vast majority of surgeries that are currently being conducted. We're already at the point of doing that for some smaller surgeries. And you
Yeah.
combine that with like stem cells, regenerative medicine, the ability to actually get the body to heal itself rather than just replace something that's organic with something that's inorganic. And I think there's going to be a very large shift in that direction.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's already happening. I do a lot of cardiothoracic anesthesia for thoracic surgeries, for lung resections, for cancer. I mean, we've taken out one whole lung, and the patient if you look at the patient's incision, they're just tiny incisions.
Yeah.
And they go home within a few days. I mean, the recovery is phenomenal. And, we're using a robot to do it. So we're actually placing holes in the patient, small incisions. We're using a robot that the surgeon is sitting in a portal while the robot is docked on the patient. And it's really amazing to see how it's done. And it also improves their outcomes. I mean, imagine
I'd
not
imagine.
having a huge incision for a surgery like that.
Normally people who have massive holes in them, that's considered a problem. So it's typically a good thing for the doctor to be able to avoid creating said massive hole.
Right, right, right. And like, as a patient myself, I had a C-section recently, for example. And yeah, that's like it's definitely difficult being on the other side, like
Yeah, I would imagine.
recovery from the C-section is no joke. So um, I'm looking forward to the day where we can do things even more minimally invasively. But, I think we're already moving in that direction in so many ways. Yeah, like very, very, there are very few cases where, you have to resort to an open surgery. Most cases can be done in a minimally invasive way. So yeah, the
Just waiting for
future is
that to get to
bright.
dentistry.
Oh, I don't know when that will happen. I mean, have
I
a
mean,
robot. I don't know if I want a robot to do my dental work, but
I'd say it's less
we'll
just a
see.
robot doing the dental work and more, at least not like one of the large ones, but what dentists are doing is they're taking big drills and
Yeah,
going to town on your mouth. There's definitely
right.
a better way to do that. I think we're going to actually be able to end up causing cavities to regrow instead of just filling them with some substance that may or may not help in the long run.
Yeah, yeah, that's totally true. Like maybe injecting them with some sort of, I don't know, growth hormone or therapy to kind of reduce their spread or something, or an antibiotic that would reduce their spread. I'm sure
Maybe
it's
even some sort
there.
of targeted stem cell that will go and actually regrow the damaged tissue. Like that, I don't think we're
Yeah,
too far away from that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we're in medicine, we're very stuck in our ways. We're creatures of habits. I'm a creature of habit. And I think that this is also why I've decided to do these videos. Is also, I think it's really important to see what's out there, what the future is. I mean, the work that you're doing, for example, uh, we don't often see it in the hospital. It may be there, but no one's really talking about it. And a lot of us are interested in knowing this information. So I am really trying to kind of connect the dots between like the practicing physician and just technology engineers, CEOs, founders that are working on really cool innovation.
And we appreciate that. It definitely is something that needs to happen more. There's such a disconnect between what technology can do and what actually happens within the hospitals. A lot of this is the bureaucratic regulatory hurdles, but a lot of that is
Yeah,
just older doctors with all the power are the ones most stuck in their ways. And if they've been doing something a certain way for 20 years, they're going to keep doing it that way because it's worked for them.
yeah, yeah. But I think we're making changes. I'm really hopeful that with time, I think things are really going to change. Sometimes change doesn't happen as quickly as we want it to, but you know, in the hospital, we've seen a lot of changes happening. I mean, just even with telemedicine, with the use of telemedicine, with the use of electronic medical record systems, as primitive as it sounds, like, there's still people that don't have EMR in their offices. So, you
They have
know,
fax machines, though. At least that's technology, right?
yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, we're making progress, but I'm hoping that things will accelerate further in the future.
I would definitely hope so, but we're getting there. And advantage of the pandemic is that it has accelerated a lot of avenues in that regard, way, way more than they otherwise would have.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So my last question for you is, what's the most important piece of advice that you have for someone who's interested in career and pursuing a career in healthcare tech, in med tech, or in biotech? What advice do you have for them?
I'd say it's twofold. There's one side of it, which is the biggest hurdle towards any type of innovation achieving commercial success within health tech is regulatory. As unfortunate as that may be, there are so many brilliant innovations that never actually make it, or there's 15 different versions of them that are in tiny little health systems that have never managed to get beyond that. because of the regulatory hurdles. So if you really are moving in that space, then either learning about said things yourself or really finding an expert to advise you in some way, that's going to be one of the key barriers to entry and is also one of the key determinants of success. So that's one step of that process.
Mhm.
The other side really is, don't look at what is happening now, look at what might be happening in 10 years and develop your expertise towards that. I have friends who are going into radiology now and finishing up their degrees. And honestly, if you're finishing up a degree in radiology at the moment, but you're not spending any time learning about machine learning, your future is not going to be as bright as the programmer who specializes in machine learning and also learns a bit about radiology. So it really is, pick the topics that really excite you, that interest you, and figure out what is the current state of technology in the cutting edge level, like what is being published in that field. Think, what direction is that going to go in, and what foundational skills should I learn to be a part of that branch of innovation rather than the branch of current practice.
Yeah. All right. That's great advice. And can you tell us where the audience can find you?
Sure. There's a variety of different places. You can go to a personal website, anasaver.com. You can go to Instagram, a biohacked life. I recently launched a TikTok, which is now doing surprisingly well for having been open for like a week.
Oh, you did? That's awesome.
I launched it probably a week and a half ago, and I'm at 14,000 followers and climbing. So it's
Nice.
been a fun launch. Definitely devoting more time to that right now. So that's at Distilled Science.
Okay, I'll follow you. I was on TikTok as well. I am on TikTok, but I haven't been very active on it recently, but it's a great platform. It's also a fun one.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Like, I love writing articles. Like, I've got a Medium account where I basically publish long form sort of technological dives into lots of, more recently, aspects of the pandemic. But
Yeah.
the amount of time it takes to go through and create an article with 30 different research papers cited that nobody's going to read versus creating fun 1-minute videos that honestly can still take a couple of hours if you're doing it in detail. But
Yeah.
it's a platform it forces you to really get to the essence of what you're trying to convey, which is an interesting challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm sure we'll meet again. Hopefully we'll meet in person at some point.
Absolutely. I definitely look forward to meeting all these people that are really cool that we've met over the course of the pandemic and actually spending some in-person time with them once this is all over.
Yeah, hopefully. I know Alex is planning something. I know you guys are planning something, so hopefully that'll happen soon. But thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. I'm gonna end.